This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight is Dimitri Lascaris. He's a Canadian born of Greek origin. He recently visited Russia and Crimea, where we met. I'm very happy to welcome you, Dimitri. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Regis. It's a pleasure to join you this evening. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, let's first turn to your background. I'd like my viewers to get to know a little bit about you as we did when you were here. So tell me about your background, where you were born, family life, education growing up, undergraduate school, and then law school.
So I was born in London, Ontario, a city of a few 100,000 people, kind of halfway between Detroit and Buffalo in the Canadian province of Ontario. And in the early 60s, my parents immigrated from Greece to Canada in the 1950s. They were born during the Depression in Greece in a small village in the southern part of the country. They lived through the Second World War in a particularly brutal Nazi occupation. They often told us stories of what they witnessed as children. And it was, I'm sure for them, a traumatic experience. And then, regrettably, it didn't end there for the people of Greece. When the Second World War ended, a civil war erupted in Greece, and the two sides on one side were basically the communists who had led the resistance, a very vigorous resistance to the Nazi occupation. And the other side were a sort of motley collection of monarchists and neoliberals and Nazi collaborators who were supported by the British and the Americans. And out of that, wreckage, my parents were afforded the opportunity to come to Canada, as were many other people from Southern Europe. They didn't have even a year of high school education. They didn't speak any Greek, but their sort of economic prospects were very bleak in Greece at the time, and so they accepted the invitation to come to Canada. I was raised at a time, in the 60s and the 70s when there actually was a significant amount of bigotry towards people from Southern Europe in Canada, and I experienced that myself, as did my family. It was nothing, of course, compared to what Indigenous people and Black persons have had to endure in Canada, but it nevertheless was an insight into sort of the ugly side of white supremacy in Canada. And I grew up in London, Ontario. I attended public school there. And then upon my graduation from high school, I entered studies at the University of Western Ontario, also in London, Ontario. My parents weren't able to fund my education, although they did graciously allow me to live at home without having to pay any expenses. And then I applied to law school in my fourth year of studies at University of Western Ontario, and I was accepted to several schools, and I ultimately enrolled at the University of Toronto, moved to Toronto, and by the time I finished my 7 years of studies, I think I had accumulated quite a large amount of student debt. And although I really wanted to be a litigator, I accepted a position at a Wall Street law firm by the name of Sullivan and Cromwell and became a securities lawyer, partly because I was really intrigued by the idea of living in New York, excited about the challenge of being a Wall Street attorney, but also I had, frankly, a lot of debt, as I mentioned, and I needed an income to be able to service that debt. So I went off to New York as soon as I graduated from the University of Toronto in 1990. And I was actually called to the New York bar long before I was called to the bar in Ontario. I didn't bother applying to the Ontario bar until 2004. I worked for a couple of years in the New York office of this firm, and then I requested and was granted a transfer to the Paris office. I went there for a few years, and when my term was up in Paris, I was invited to return to the New York office, but I declined that offer because I basically had enough of being a Wall Street attorney. It was quite a grind. It was not in any way enriching work. In fact, I'd say in many ways it was a soul-crushing experience. And so eventually I made my way back to Canada. I became a class actions lawyer, and went to the other side and began to represent defrauded investors. And I did that for some 10 years, and I led a team of lawyers, which was the largest group of securities class actions lawyers in the country, and found myself at the age of 54, back in 2015 or so, in a position where I didn't need to practice law anymore, or at least I didn't need to make money from the practice of law. So I retired from my firm, and I began to do a lot of pro bono work, particularly in the human rights field, and also began to do a lot of journalism for an organization called the Real News Network, which was based in Baltimore, Maryland. That was a passion of mine. I didn't do it to make a living. I did it purely out of a commitment to journalism. And then to conclude my long-winded answer to your question, in 2020, I decided to run for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. It was a hotly contested race. There were 8 candidates, and ultimately I finished second with 45% of the vote. When the opportunity presented itself 2 years later, because the person who defeated me only lasted about a year in the job, I actually declined to run again to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada. And I issued a statement at the time explaining my reasons for doing that. The decision I made was actually about a month after Russia intervened militarily in Ukraine in February of last year. And at that time, one of the things that I said was, I don't think that if I were to delve back into politics, I would be able to speak my mind about this war, which I regard as an existential threat. And I have to be free to do that as a matter of conscience. And so I'm not going to pursue the opportunity to become the leader of the Green Party of Canada. I'm going to more or less remain a free agent. And I've been speaking out ever since, as vigorously as I can, about what I regard as a morally depraved policy towards this war that we have adopted in the West.
I have to ask you, what do you mean by a morally depraved conflict by the West?
Well, Regis, I think, anybody who looks honestly, whatever your views may be about this conflict, whatever your views may be about the Russian government, anybody who looks honestly and objectively at the foreign policy and human rights record of the United States government and its allies, including the Canadian government, would accept readily that the West's policies towards Ukraine have absolutely nothing to do with international law, human rights, or democracy. Since when did the West, prioritize respect for international law, human rights, and democracy? Did it do that in Iraq? Did it do that in Afghanistan? Did it do that in Libya? Did it do that in Palestine? Of course not. So that opens up a question. And the question is, what is the West really up to? And I think the answer is crystal clear. What the West is up to is hegemony. It's an agenda of maintaining global hegemony, something the West has been able to do since the collapse of the Soviet Union back in the 90s. And Ukraine is effectively being used as a battering ram. It's being used as a battering ram to weaken a resurgent Russia. Russia was humiliated in the 90s. There was a drunken buffoon by the name of Boris Yeltsin who basically did the bidding of the Clinton administration while he was in office. The Russian people suffered enormously. But that was something that I think, fortunately for the Russian people and frankly for the world, didn't last. And Russia began to recover from that period of humiliation and weakness and economic despair. The United States government sees this as a challenge to its global hegemony, even though I don't think the Russian government has really ever demonstrated any kind of a desire to reconstitute the Soviet Union. It feels genuinely threatened by Russia. And the West is basically saying, not openly, it's providing various pretexts for what it's doing, but what it's actually doing is using Ukrainians to weaken Russia. And this will ultimately end in the destruction of Ukraine. And I don't think the Western governments really particularly care about that, frankly. What they're interested in is causing as much damage to Russia as possible. And if they succeed in this initiative, and I don't think they will, the next target is going to be China, and particularly Taiwan and the South China Sea. And if we manage to get through all of that without a nuclear war, World War III, we will be extraordinarily lucky. So that's what I mean by morally depraved. Basically, the Western governments are imperiling the future of our children in order to preserve Western hegemony. And if that's not moral depravity, I don't know what is.
I'd be mistaken, but I recall when you came to Crimea, and we'll talk about that a little bit more a bit later. You said initially you thought that Russia's invasion was illegal, but if I'm not mistaken, you said you changed your mind. Could you explain that further?
That's some kind of what I said, so I need to flesh that out with you, Regis. Let me start by saying I am, as we've discussed, I'm a lawyer. I've been a practicing lawyer for over 30 years, and I approach these questions as a lawyer, and I have always had a particular interest in international law. And the current, international legal architecture, and the sort of centerpiece of that when it comes to war is the United Nations Charter, was drafted in the aftermath of two absolutely devastating and horrific world wars. And the drafters of this charter were determined to limit to the maximum possible degree the circumstances in which military force could be used by one sovereign state against another. And it's important to understand, legal is not necessarily what is moral. You can have a moral justification to do something, but it's not compliant with the law. This is not just something, this truism doesn't apply simply to international law and the question of war. As a lawyer, you encounter situations all the time where, where the law stipulates something that is not particularly moral or ethical. That's unfortunately the world in which we live. So I want to distinguish between the question, did Russia have a moral justification for intervening, and was it compliant with the UN Charter? My analysis at the outset was that Russia could not invoke under international law the right to self-defense because there was no compelling evidence that the state of Ukraine was going to attack Russia itself. And Russia, therefore, was in a situation where it had to call upon international organs to intervene in order to address its concerns. But unless and until an attack on Russia itself was imminent, a military intervention by Russia would not meet the strict requirements of the UN Charter. Now, what I came to understand as I looked at the situation, I learned more about what was going on in the Donbass in particular at the time. This is something I had not fully appreciated when I first formed an opinion about the legality of the war, is that the Ukrainian military, there were many indications that it was on the verge of launching a devastating attack on the rebel-held parts of Ukraine, which have now been annexed by Russia, namely Donetsk, Luhansk. It's often forgotten that, Vladimir Putin is himself a lawyer, and he approaches these questions rather legalistically. In a very short period of time, when the threat evolved and became evident to the Russian government, the people's republics in Luhansk and Donetsk declared sovereignty, and the Russian government promptly recognized them as sovereign states. And then, as a matter of international law, if in fact they were at that point in time sovereign states, they had a right to invite another sovereign state to come to their aid to defend themselves from an attack by the Ukrainian military. So the question, so I think the real question comes down to this in terms of legality. Was the fact that they declared sovereignty and that the Russian government recognized them as sovereign states enough to give them the status of sovereign states in international law? That's a debatable point. And I think the question from my perspective now, because that's, the answer to that question is unclear. My view about the legality of the conflict is quite mixed. And I think you could debate it either way. I think a skillful lawyer representing the Russian government could make a persuasive case that it was legal. A skillful lawyer representing the Ukrainian government could make a persuasive case that it's illegal. And this is not unusual in the law. Oftentimes the answer to a legal question is not black and white. Skillful lawyers can make a persuasive case based upon ambiguous facts. So that's where I currently stand on the legality. On the morality of it, I do think that there is strong evidence that Ukraine was about to launch a devastating attack against Donetsk and Luhansk. There's strong evidence that the Ukrainian military had been infiltrated by neo-Nazi groups, and that they, in particular, posed a threat to the peoples of Luhansk and Donetsk. There is strong evidence that NATO posed a serious threat to Russia, and there's absolutely overwhelming evidence that Western governments promised Gorbachev, when the question of German reunification was being debated, that NATO would not expand eastward. NATO repeatedly violated that commitment, taking its forces right up to the border of Russia. So from a moral perspective, I understand perfectly well what Russia did. From a legal perspective, it's a debatable question.
Okay. You've clarified that. I hope for a lot of people, the legality versus the morality or ethical position. What about the fact, and I believe it is a fact, that the United States in particular has been provoking the Soviet Union, then Russia, at least since World War II with the dropping of the bombs on Japan. It's fairly well known and accepted that that was a message to Stalin and the Soviet Union, we're the big guys in town. And ever since then, and certainly since Vietnam, Ronald Reagan, and every president since then have continued to provoke the Soviet Union and then Russia. Reagan even calling it the evil empire, a soulless country, the Red Menace. And then we see, as you mentioned, NATO, and basically it's the United States behind all of this, moving directly to Russia's borders, encompassing many of the former Soviet republics, and every year staging ever increasing massive war games, live fire war games, gaming a first strike attack on Russia to decapitate it. Do these things fit into your argument, Dimitri?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you just said. I think those are all entirely valid points. Under the UN Charter, however, under international law, an attack must be imminent. And I stress the word imminent. So, and one might argue that this is a flaw in the international legal architecture. One might argue that it's essential that we impose that requirement, because otherwise, countries, states are going to take liberties with the facts and say that an attack was imminent, that was potentially going to be launched at some point in the future, and use that as a pretext to themselves wage a war of aggression. So at the end of the day, the real question from a legal perspective, Regis, is whether everything that all these historical facts that you've rightly pointed to lead to the conclusion that attack on Russia was imminent by NATO or by its proxy, the Ukrainian government. I think it's hard on the evidence to make that case. You could make the case certainly that an attack somewhere down the road was possible, that NATO might at some stage launch a first strike from Ukrainian territory. And because of the proximity of those weapons to Moscow and other major urban centers and industrial facilities in Russia, that this posed a serious threat to Russia, but was an attack imminent? I think that's a hard case to make. But as I say, there's this other branch of the law, where you also have to look at whether or not Donetsk and Luhansk were themselves sovereign states at the time that they called upon the Russian government to come to their aid. That's another line of legal argument that is available to Russia. And yet another one is something called the responsibility to protect. Even if they weren't sovereign states, it may be that under this so-called doctrine of the responsibility to protect, that Russia had a right to intervene. I personally have been criticizing the responsibility to protect doctrine for many years, because, for example, it was used in Serbia to devastating effect. It was used in Libya to devastating effect. So I'm deeply, suspicious about the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. It's open to considerable abuse, as history has shown. So there's a number of legal arguments that Russia could make plausibly. But again, I think it's hard on the facts to say that there was an attack by NATO or the Ukrainian proxy that was imminent on Russia itself.
Okay, you're making this really perfectly clear, even for a layman like me. I'm not a lawyer, but what about precedent? And most people listening and watching this show will remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union had nuclear missiles in Cuba, only some 90 miles from Florida, a couple hundred miles from Washington, New York City, whatever. And we were on the verge of nuclear war. I was in high school then, and I still remember duck and cover. People were building bomb shelters, and you saw nuclear signs, symbols all over the place where this was a bomb shelter. Now, the United States interpreted that as an imminent attack on the mainland of the United States. Couldn't one argue that all of these military games directly on Russia's border, the U-2 spy plane that was shot down flying over Russia, in Russia's mind, and I live here now, and I try to put myself in the position of an ordinary Russian, forget the Kremlin, but an ordinary Russian, I would consider these things imminent threats. Now, what would have happened if Russia or China did the same thing on the West Coast, East Coast, in Mexico, in Cuba, in the Bahamas? Would this not be some kind of justification for the position Russia has taken and how they see the world and the United States in particular?
I think that I think the Cuban Missile Crisis is a very interesting comparison to the current situation. Let's bear in mind that when the Cuban government invited the Soviet Union and it was a sovereign state and it had the right to do this, invited the Soviet Union to introduce some nuclear missiles onto its own territory. There had been repeated attempts by the United States government to overthrow the Cuban government and to assassinate its leadership, including the Bay of Pigs. So it's important to understand that the Cuban government had every reason, every justification to feel threatened by the United States and to take quite drastic steps in order to protect itself from future attack. And I would not disagree with that at all. The United States then, of course, having discovered the presence of these nuclear missiles, introduced, it didn't actually attack the Soviet Union at that time, as we all know, nor did it at that stage launch attacks on Cuba itself, although it had tried to overthrow the Cuban government previously. What it did was, and this is a clever move by JFK, was it introduced a blockade. I personally feel that the blockade was of highly questionable legality. It was arguably an act of war, and And I don't think that the facts, particularly when you take into account that the U.S. government had attempted repeatedly to overthrow the Cuban government, I don't think the facts provided a lawful justification for the United States to introduce a blockade. So it's a precedent in the sense that, the Russians could, with complete justification, say to the Americans, look what you did, when the Cubans invited us onto their territory after you attempted repeatedly to overthrow them. But that kind of, sidesteps the question of whether what the United States did in response was legal. I doubt very much that it was legal. Fortunately, at the end of the day, it ended up working in the sense they reached a mutual accommodation, and the Soviets withdrew their weapons from Cuba, and the U.S. government later withdrew nuclear weapons from Turkey. The outcome was good, but the actual implementation of a blockade on Cuba was of highly questionable legality, in my opinion.
Wow. This has been really fascinating to have an accomplished attorney like yourself to break this down in terms of the legality, the morality, and whether it's ethical or not, together with what we're talking about, the precedent set in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all of the provocations and threats that the United States has made on Russia. So I want to thank that. It's very enlightening, and I've been taking some notes on what you're saying because I don't want to forget some of this, even though I could replay this show over and over again. I want to ask you now, given the position you've taken, why on earth did you decide to come to Russia and then saunter on down to the beautiful, wonderful, historic, cultural Crimea?
Well, in a word, because I think we are living through the most dangerous moment in human history. We are in a hot war. We, as in the West, where I'm currently living, and very much against my own will and the will of many persons of conscience in the West, our governments are in a hot war against a nuclear armed state. This is, in my opinion, we're way beyond the danger created by the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, things never got to this degree where we have boots on the ground, active members of our military, certain Western militaries, including special forces from the United States, British special forces. They are in Ukraine, providing assistance in real time to the Ukrainian military. We have former members or people who are who claim to be former members of NATO militaries, actually on the front line killing Russians and dying. We are providing tens of billions of dollars of weaponry to Ukraine, and the lethality of the weaponry that we're sending is escalating. And we are providing real-time battlefield intelligence to the Ukrainians in order to enable them to inflict maximum damage on not only Russian military forces, but also on infrastructure, dual-use infrastructure. And on top of all of that, our governments have imposed upon Russia, in violation of international law, because they have not been approved by the United Nations, a set of sanctions that is plainly designed to destroy the Russian economy. In every sense of the word, we are at war with Russia, and we've never been in a situation like this before. And on top of all of that, Regis, we have an ecological and climate crisis that's spinning out of control, and the only way we're going to get a grip on that is if we actually achieve a level of international cooperation that is without precedent in the modern era. We are actually going in the opposite direction in terms of international cooperation. The world is dividing into two blocks, one block led by China and Russia, the other led by the United States. And we are watching and witnessing a rapid decline in international cooperation. So when you add all of this up, it's an extraordinarily dangerous moment. In situations such as this, like what I do fundamentally, Regis, is I call myself litigator. As people, lawyers who do what I do, we call ourselves litigators. But really what we're involved in is dispute resolution. We represent people who are in a dispute, in a zero-sum game, and we find ways to resolve it. Sometimes we have to go to court. Court is the jurisprudential equivalent of a battlefield. Of course, people aren't dying, but you're going to war in a legal sense, and a neutral arbiter is deciding a winner and a loser. And what I've learned in the course of my legal career is that if you're going to resolve disputes without, a final battle where someone is declared the winner and someone is declared the loser, and of course, when you're dealing with actual war, that means a lot of death and destruction to get to that point. You have to talk to the other side. You have to have strategic empathy. You have to be able to understand what their concerns are, identify those of their concerns which are legitimate, find a way to speak their language, and also call upon them to make that same effort with respect to you and your concerns. There has to be dialogue. That is the prerequisite to the peaceful resolution of any dispute, and we are currently in an existentially dangerous dispute with Russia. So what I see from my side, living in the West, is every single institution in the West, whether we're talking about the media, whether we're talking about governments, whether we're talking about think tanks, they are all trying to shut down dialogue. They are trying to ban discourse with the Russian government. They are trying to censor the Russian government. What we should be doing is listening to the Russian government, sitting down at a table with them and having a conversation. And because the leaders of the West and all of these institutions are failing to do that, it falls to us as citizens, persons of conscience who are committed to peace and understand the danger of this moment, to initiate that dialogue in any way that we can. That's why I came to Russia. I want to help foster a dialogue. I'm just one person. For this to work, I need a lot more people. We all need a lot more people to engage in this kind of initiative, those who are in a position to do so. But I thought I can make potentially some contribution, even if it's a small one, to facilitating a dialogue. And that's why I came. And frankly, I think it was one of the best decisions that I ever made. I really, on a personal level, I feel far more knowledgeable. I'm by no means an expert in Russia. I've got a great deal more to learn. But I feel far more knowledgeable about the people of Russia, the culture of Russia, the political system, and what the Russian people and the Russian government feel about this conflict than I did before I came to Russia.
Okay. You told me quite a bit about what you did when you were in Moscow and who you met with. Tell us a little bit about that, because you met with some pretty influential people and institutions.
Mm-hmm. So let me say that my decision to come was entirely my own. I was not invited. And in fact, I think that the whole idea of coming was I really began to think seriously about coming when a good friend of mine, a Canadian peace activist, is doing a doctorate in international relations at a Canadian university. Her name is Tamara Lawrence. She came, and I think she actually introduced you and I by email, if I'm not mistaken, Regis. She came to Russia about 2 months before I did. And she said to me that she had had a meeting with the Russian ambassador in which he mentioned my name. Apparently, he was aware of my commentary, the Russian ambassador to Canada. Apparently, he was aware of my criticisms of Western governments towards this war and towards Russia. And so I took the opportunity, having decided to come, and partly that was inspired by Tamara's experiences in Russia, which she spoke very highly about. Having heard about this, I decided to reach out to the Russian ambassador to Canada a couple of weeks before my departure. And I explained to him why I was coming. I had never spoken to him before, never met the man. He was very gracious and said, Dimitri, I am aware of your commentary, and I appreciate your taking this step, and I'm going to do what I can to facilitate the kinds of meetings you want to have. And so he reached out to a number of people, and as a result of those requests from the Russian ambassador to Canada, I met with the dean and the deputy dean of McGill University, which is, as I understand it, the premier university institution for training Russian diplomats and international relations experts. he reached out to the director of IMIMO, which I understand is the largest think tank to Russia, and I had the most amazing meeting there as a result. I went out to their huge offices in a little bit outside of central Moscow, and they escorted me into a large conference room. And when I walked in there, there were about 25 experts, and experts in everything you can imagine: agriculture, financial regulation, sanctions, military experts, banking. And I sat there for 2 hours. They gave me 2 hours of their time, and I peppered them with questions. And they were all fluent in English. They were all very, I would say, impressive in terms of their expertise, their knowledge, and the balance and sort of equanimity with which they spoke. It was really a quite impressive experience. I also, as a result of the Russian ambassador's assistance, had a meeting with two officials at the Russian Foreign Ministry, one of whom had been a diplomat in Canada, and he was expelled from Canada by the Canadian government because he disclosed or revealed that Canada's deputy minister at the time, Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister at that time, Chrystia Freeland, who is now the deputy prime minister, that she had lied about her grandfather. She's of Ukrainian origin, and her grandfather, it turns out, was a Nazi collaborator. And she had, during the Second World War, and she had characterized him in her public commentary as a champion of democracy. So this was revealed, and this is a historical fact. Even the Canadian media, acknowledged that, in fact, Miss Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi collaborator. And when this diplomat revealed it, they expelled him from the country. And he met with me, as did a press officer of the Russian Foreign Ministry. And we talked about what the outline of a peace deal would look like. That was a fascinating experience. I also was invited to speak at the Valdai Club. I was part of a 5-person panel, which was examining the question of de-dollarization, the growing movement in the international financial system for countries to reduce their reliance upon the US dollar. And I just, also just sort of met a lot of random people and talked to a lot of random people about their feelings about the war, about the Russian government, about what's happening in Ukraine. So that's what happened. And that's not an exhaustive list, but those are sort of the highlights of what I experienced when I was in Moscow. And I spent a total of, I think, 18 days there, 10 days at the beginning and 8 days at the end after I came to Crimea, and spent some time with yourself and Tanya, who was my guide and a wonderful translator.
How would you describe your mission or your purpose for coming to Russia?
I would, I had an interview on, as you know, Regis, I was asked by RT to have an interview with Oksana Boychuk of a program called Worlds Apart, or I think her name, I may have mispronounced her name, it might be Boyko, but Oksana and I had a half-hour discussion about my reasons for coming to Russia, and RT chose a title which I thought was very apt for the episode, and it was Citizen Diplomacy, One Handshake at a Time. I really can't come up with a better way to describe what I was doing in Russia than that. I was also obviously doing a lot of journalism, so it wasn't purely diplomacy. I was really focused upon journalism, especially when I was in Crimea.
Before we talk about Crimea, what do you mean by doing journalism?
Well, so there were really two components to my trip. One was, as I mentioned, trying to facilitate a dialogue with influential persons within Russia and just ordinary Russians. But the other component was sharing with people back in the West what I was learning. Because the Western media are doing an absolutely appalling job of, I think, presenting fairly what Russia is today, what its government is trying to do, what is happening in this war, why this war is taking place. The journalistic part was me reporting back to people in Canada and other Western countries about what I was learning on the ground. The diplomacy part was meeting with Russian people and Russian representatives and trying to facilitate dialogue.
So would you consider yourself a blogger, or do you submit your articles to major publications, mainstream media in Canada or around the world?
That's an interesting question. So when I was practicing class actions law, and before I became outspoken in terms of my criticism of the Canadian government's foreign policies, I was quoted quite frequently by the mainstream media in Canada, usually related to. I was often, my comment was often sought on developments in the financial markets, not about foreign policy. Then when I retired from class actions practice full time and I became an outspoken critic of foreign policy, the mainstream media organizations really began to ignore me. And I began to publish work on independent media sites. I mentioned one, the Real News Network. I did hundreds of reports for the Real News Network, which is a not-for-profit independent media organization based in the U.S. Other independent media sites that I've published my work are Counterpunch, Canadian Dimension in Canada, also Truth Out. From time to time, I've taken my work and I've presented it to independent media organizations. I actually have had a few op-eds on foreign policy published by the mainstream media in Canada, but that's a challenge, getting them to publish my work, because it's definitely not what they want their readers to hear. And then I put a lot of stuff on my website, which is dimitrilascaris.org. That's currently where I'm primarily publishing my work. And by the way, I am an accredited journalist. I'm a member of the union in Canada for freelance journalists. I have a press card issued by that union. As I say, this is not a way I make a living, but it is a passion of mine, and it's certainly a big part of the reason why I went to Crimea.
All right, well, let's shift gears now and talk about why you came down to Crimea. I know that it wasn't much of a vacation.
If I honestly, Regis, you hit the nail on the head. If as beautiful a place as Crimea is, that was not in any way, shape, or form my reason for coming. What I expected to find there was a war zone. It was interesting what I actually experienced, but just sort of hearing from afar what was going on in Crimea, all of this talk of Crimea being retaken by force by the Ukrainian government. Prior to my coming there, there had been a number of drone attacks on naval forces in Sebastopol. I believe a couple of them had actually caused some damage and even caused a few naval personnel, Russian naval personnel, to be killed. And of course, there was the attack on the Kerch Bridge before I came down. That was a very serious attack. So I thought I was going to do a war zone, and that's the way I looked at it. And it was definitely tremendously hard work being there. We saw, as you know, a lot of stuff in a very short period of time. And by the way, I should mention this. You may be interested to know that in Canada, there's a think tank called the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a very right-wing, neoconservative think tank. They have somebody who holds himself out as a disinformation expert and a Russia expert, and his name is Marcus Kolga. And Mr. Kolga gave testimony to the Canadian Parliament after I left Crimea, and he alleged falsely that I had violated Canadian law by coming to Crimea as a tourist. So, and also there was a front page article on the National Post, which is one of the most important newspapers in Canada, very right-leaning, very neoconservative newspaper, accusing me of having, it was a very lengthy piece accusing me of having come to Russia in order to whitewash the crimes of Vladimir Putin. That's what the headline said. So my trip to Crimea has generated quite a bit of hostility from the neoconservatives in Canada. But of course, it was, as you know very well, Regis, it was not even remotely a vacation. It wasn't tourism in any meaningful sense of the word. But it was a tremendously enlightening experience, and I think it was the right decision for me to go.
All right. Well, I have to ask you, why was it such an enlightening experience? I know that Tatiana Buharia and I escorted you around and arranged a variety of meetings with you. What were some of your impressions?
Well, I didn't speak to anybody. I mean, the many people that I spoke to in Crimea, not one of them expressed a desire to see Crimea return to the rule of the government in Kiev. Every single person I spoke to was adamantly opposed to that. I spoke to, as you know, we went up to the border. We spoke to the border between Crimea and Kherson Oblast, and we spoke to workers from an NGO that deals with refugees from the war zone. I spoke with the director of a refugee center in Sevastopol. I spoke with a journalist, a military correspondent by the name of Sergei Gorbachev, who I think is the head of the journalists union, or the Sebastopol branch of the Russian Journalists Union. I spoke to a soldier by the name of Gennady, a 60-year-old soldier who had gone to Donetsk region last year, volunteered to fight and to defend, the people of Donetsk. Those are just some of the people I spoke to, and uniformly, every single one of them said they don't want anything more to do with the government in Kiev. And this raises, again, as a lawyer, I look at this and I say, we have something in international law called the right to self-determination. We recognize that is a valid right under international law, that all people have the right to self-determination. And we in the West are not trying to understand in any meaningful way whether, in fact, the people of Crimea want to be part of Ukraine. We just keep saying over and over again that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. But what about the right of self-determination? People want to dispute the legality or the validity of the referendum that was held in Crimea in 2014. Okay, go ahead and do that. But that doesn't mean that we should simply ignore the will of the Korean people. What that means is we should find a way to determine what they actually want. And I'd be really interested to know, if we held an internationally supervised referendum today in Crimea, what would the outcome be? Based on my personal interactions with people, I think it would be a resounding, affirmation of the unification of Crimea with Russia. That's just based upon my own experiences. That really stood out for me. Another thing that really stood out for me is I understood just how, and of course I have to say I'm no military expert. I've never served in the military, but based on what I saw, I think the idea that Ukraine is going to retake Crimea by force is delusional. It's absolutely delusional. And if the Ukrainian government were actually to send its forces en masse to Crimea to try to retake it by force, there would be a bloodbath. It would be an act of, military suicide. And I think we should just, if we're being sensible and humane, we should just eliminate from our discussions any talk about Crimea being retaken by force. If we're going to deal with this problem, we have to deal with this by negotiation and dialogue. The idea that the Ukrainians are going to come in there and reoccupy Crimea is really, it's like, fantasy land. I think, again, I'm not a military expert, but that's my assessment based on what I saw and heard. One thing that really impressed me, Regis, was that the people I spoke to, and I spoke to many people about, Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, although I think it's fair to say there is widespread contempt for the government and particularly Mr. Zelensky, who was repeatedly described to me as a comedian by the people I spoke to in Crimea, I didn't really sense any hostility towards the Ukrainian people themselves, which was remarkable. I think there was in fact, a lot of people have sort of expressed sympathy and hope that, they'll be liberated from what they regard as a corrupt and illegitimate government. So that was a surprise. And I myself was surprised at how little hostility I encountered. My government is at war with Russia. And, all the people I spoke to, even though they have strong, feelings of affinity for Russia, none of them evinced the slightest bit of hostility towards me, even though they knew that I was Canadian. So those are some of the things that really stood out for me. And I have to say that I think, I should say one other thing. I was surprised by how little affected on the surface life seemed to be, despite the fact that Crimea has come under attack. Things, for the most part, seemed to be peaceful, orderly, and people were going about their daily business. There certainly didn't seem to be an air of crisis while I was there.
Well, I, for one, appreciate that, because not many people believe everything I've been saying about life here in Crimea is going on quite like normal. You made a couple of interesting points that I definitely want to underscore. The people here and in Russia they feel very close to their Slavic brothers and sisters in Ukraine. You pointed out that it's the government that they abhor, that they do not agree with, and that they are at war with. You met some people whose families have been divided by this conflict. Divorces have taken place. Brothers and sisters, husbands and wives don't talk to each other anymore because of what has happened. So it's a terrible humanitarian crisis as well. I want you to explain, because you said it's delusional for Ukraine to think that they can take back Crimea. We went to the border, and I know you've written about this. You even had pictures of it. Can you explain why it is physically impossible for Ukraine to invade Crimea?
Well, look, again, I don't think I think it's so obvious that is a pipe dream that you don't actually have to be a military expert to understand the practical impossibility of that happening. So basically, as I explained in this article I wrote about, our visit to the Kherson Crimea border, and I hadn't understood this before I actually came to Crimea. Crimea is joined by land to Kherson, or what the Ukrainian government would consider to be mainland Ukraine, by two little narrow pieces of land. We were on one of those narrow pieces of land, and I'm sure that what we saw on that spit of land is very similar to what is taking place on the other. I would be shocked if it isn't. And what we saw as we were driving through this very narrow piece of land was line after line of tank obstacles and trench works. And each of these narrow pieces of land is, flanked by a large body of water. And not only that, but the land is essentially flat in these two narrow passages, or at least the one that we saw, and there's very little tree cover. So what would happen if the Ukrainian military tried to enter Crimea through one of these narrow passages of land in force, with a large land force? They would be sitting ducks. They would get, first of all, bogged down by the trench works and by the tank obstacles, and then they would just be wide open, no cover, no protection whatsoever, exposed to a ferocious assault by Russian artillery and by the Russian Air Force. I can't imagine how anybody could think that that is a viable way of retaking Crimea. The only other possibility, and you've seen some of this in the public commentary coming out of the West, and by the way, it's not just me who's expressing extreme skepticism about this. Even Anthony Blinken recently, the U.S. Secretary of State, admitted, and as have other senior officials in the U.S. government, that Ukraine is not likely to retake Crimea anytime soon. But the only other possibility is an amphibious landing. So you'd have to send like Marines and ships, from, let's say, Odessa to Ukraine or to Crimea, and land a bunch of soldiers there. The problem there is that the Ukrainians have virtually no navy to speak of, and they would be confronted by the Black Sea Fleet. They would be absolutely annihilated. I can't imagine for a second that amphibious landing, probably that would be an even bigger bloodbath, I would imagine. And of course, there's very significant submarine force that the Russians have, and which the Ukrainians do not have. So they'd be bringing ships across from, let's say, Odessa to Crimea, and they'd be getting sunk left and right, by missiles and by submarine fire. Anybody who actually made it to shore would be trapped. It would be very difficult to supply them. They would be wiped out by land forces in Crimea. It's just a complete and utter pipe dream, Regis. And I think it's utterly irresponsible for the Zelensky regime to constantly be saying to the people of Ukraine, we're going to retake Crimea by force, and it's going to happen this year. Zelensky actually went so far as to say a few months ago that he would be fishing in Crimea this summer. This is just an absolute bald-faced lie. It's giving the Ukrainian people false hope, and that false hope is prolonging a war which will ultimately end in Ukraine's destruction. It's extremely irresponsible. As a leader in wartime, yes, you have an obligation to maintain the morale of your people, but you also have an obligation to be truthful with them, and lifting their morale and rousing the fighting spirit doesn't entitle you to make predictions that are completely delusional, which ultimately results in the destruction of your country. And I think that's exactly what Volodymyr Zelensky is doing, sadly.
Okay, I want to conclude on this note. Do you see any hope for dialogue? Do you see any hope coming from, and I'm not talking about the West. In my opinion, the West is under total control and domination by the United States of America and whoever is controlling those people. But given the rhetoric, given the hostility, the constant threats, and the constant escalation, do you see any hope for a peaceful solution to this conflict?
Regis, I try to remain optimistic, but what I see is that the leaders of the West, particularly the Biden administration, but this is also true, for example, of the Canadian government, the Trudeau government. This is certainly true of the British government. It's absolutely true of the German government and the French government. They are so politically invested in this thing at this stage that a peace deal which reasonably addressed the Russian government's legitimate concerns and demands would constitute a complete and utter humiliation for them. They have poured so much money, so much weaponry, so much of their political capital into this morally depraved war that, for them, I think they look at it from their own personal, from the perspective of their own personal power and privilege. It's either a victory or humiliation and disgrace. And so, my answer to your question is, as long as these clowns are in power, I think there's very little prospect for a peaceful resolution. However, if we can get them out of power, and this is where we, the people, come in, if we can force these people from office who are so politically invested in this disaster that there's no realistic prospect of a peaceful resolution, then maybe we can have a dialogue with the Russian government that will bring an end to this bloodbath. But we got to get them out of power. We have to get rid of Biden. We have to get rid of the conservative government. We have to get rid of Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau, all of these depraved leaders, so-called leaders who are leading us down a path which may end in nuclear war. That's our best hope for peace.